Well, thank you so much for the introduction. In fact, the book publication is still coming up. It was planned for fall 2016. It will probably be, hopefully be spring 2017, summer 2017. But thank you for to the FRIAS for having me be part of this very, very intriguing and inspiring and daring lunch lecture series on ignorance. And without further ado, let me start. What is known, I strip away. I launch all men and women forward with me into the unknown. I take these two verses from Walt Whitman's epic collection of poetry, Leaves of Grass, for despite, or maybe because of all its emphasis, its pathos, its unrestrained optimism, this short passage extraordinarily circumscribes the childlike pleasures of reading literature. As if Whitman's first-person speaker itself were taking the place of a novel or a poem, he or she opens a play space for the celebration of the unknown, the excitement of handing oneself over to the unpredictability of leaping into pristine terrain. What is known, I strip away. I do not believe that Whitman is aiming at the constitution of a state determined by a basic lack of knowledge. What he wants to eradicate is dependency upon knowledge that lets one act and think in closed systems, that lets one feel all too comfortable and sufficiently equipped to deal with the world surrounding oneself. Whitman dreads a potential lack of ambition and curiosity, and he desires to strive for new and ever new understandings of what it means to be oneself and to be in the world. To strip away what is known and to launch into the unknown means to take a risk, to rely on one's experience and conquer the new, by way of creating and immersing oneself in it. Whitman's lyrical eye wants to rid man and woman from the weight of unrestrained and useless information he or she has compiled all through the course of life. This weight is to be lifted off of its carrier so that the latter can be propelled into a future full of unforeseen experiences. Whitman, as I argue, is not only presenting his readers with an allegory for national, cultural, and individual self-empowerment, but with the most powerful image of understanding life and one's actions in it as part and parcel of an ongoing hermeneutic quest. To put it differently, what Whitman has his speaker striving for is meaning, that is, knowledge of what human being, what life, what world is, or at least potentially could be. Now, this lecture series asks scholars from various fields to discuss the value and function of knowledge, about what they know and don't know, what they do not want to or simply cannot know, and how to include these and other questions into the scope of their current research projects. The key term for this line of inquiry is, of course, not knowledge, but ignorance, which in this context does not so much refer to the deliberate ignoring of facts, as in the rather derogatory German term Ignoranz, but to the phenomenon of more or less unintentional not knowing. A given society and culture exists within and through the norms and normativity of distinct orders of knowledge that are, among other things, both products and producers of scholarly discourse. And by now, knowledge and science as paradigmatically modern institutions are engaged in a reciprocal relationship in which one can hardly determine which one emerged first. In literary studies, not least in the wake of mid and late 20th century post-structuralism and new historicism, the discussion of knowledge has in and of itself become a most intriguing field of interest. In the past few years, especially in German literary studies, a lot of research has come about that concerns itself with questions about the history of knowledge or of the particular knowledge in and of literature, questions such as in which ways literature contains, facilitates, propels, and excels knowledge. Is there an implicit knowledge to literature, or is literature a medium for the perpetuation of a greater sociocultural knowledge? Is literature the reflection of its cultural historical context, and may it, as such, be deemed a proper sociological resource? And there are not only the many questions, and the list could go on, revolving around knowledge and the unknown in literature, but also the furthering of an academic field that is eager to fight its inherent moments of ignorance. Meaning that, as in any other scholarly field, literary studies have to facilitate their own arsenals of knowledge, rid themselves of unnecessary unknowns, and decide what knowledge to maintain and what knowledge to leave behind, thereby implicitly and explicitly targeting the ever-looming question of what definitions of literature and knowledge are adduced in the first place to ask and answer all of these questions. If we, for example, think of the graduate school Factuales and Fictionales at CEON, where I'm currently employed at, one of the key questions concerns itself with the function of factual narrativity in literature, thereby drawing on the larger issue of not automatically defining literature through its fictionality, and in turn, focusing on the truth content of literature. This then leads to investigations of the function and validity of facts, be they biographical, historical, scientific, or of any other nature. Facts that draw on the reader's knowledge of her world, at which point one needs to choose one's methods and tools of analysis. Is one to use the framework of narratology, formalism, or reception theory in order to discern the nature and function of the factual? How is one to interpret the relation between fact and truth, between the different spheres of knowledge and the reader's confrontation with possible unknowns? It is this dualism of knowledge and ignorance, of understanding and the production of meaning, the tension between a present state of knowledgeability and an unforeseen future, that I want to focus on in the following. Not in opposition, but in addition to many of the more recent attempts of discerning the allegedly intricate relationship between knowledge and literature, I want to follow Whitman's cue and launch into the curious force field of the unknown. And I want to do so not by drawing on the blind spots of my field or by attempting the impossible and try to answer all the questions I've exemplarily raised above, but by elaborating on the potentiality of one of the oldest traditions in the young field of literary studies, that is, literary hermeneutics. Hermeneutics, as its origin in the name of Hermes, the messenger of the gods, suggests, is the art of transferring a message. Hermeneutics is the art of interpretation, and it is as old as the texts that were in need of such in-depth interrogation, primarily ancient writings and, of course, the Bible. One of the most paradigmatic figures in modern hermeneutics is the Romantic theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher, who has stripped hermeneutics from being bound to those traditional writings in order to present it as a universal theory of human understanding, making the written text a model for such a theory. And for Schleiermacher, the text is essential for interpretation. Accordingly, he understood the hermeneutic act of interpreting a text as the reversal of grammar and poetics, meaning that any knowledgeable reader can reveal the true meaning of any text. Schleiermacher went even so far as to argue that with the proper knowledge of context and the complete identification with the author and all the biographical information one could attain, the interpreter could understand a given text even better than its author. Arguably, this is an understanding of text interpretation that is hardly en vogue nowadays. But even though such a context and identification-bent understanding of hermeneutics has been significantly refined and expanded, as in the works of Dilthey, Heidegger, Gadamer, Sondi, and others, we may nonetheless concur with Schleiermacher's idea that hermeneutics is essentially dialogical and based on a dynamic interplay between text and reader, between knowledge and understanding. Schleiermacher knew that not only the Bible or laws, but that also all literary texts were in need of interpretation, ranging from the most basic grammatical and semantic interpretation of words and sentences to the quest of making sense of oneself and the world one lives in. Evolving within hitherto unseen rigor in a time of massive upheaval, namely the Reformation period, hermeneutics promised a heteronormative interpretation of the Bible in order to limit the role of the Catholic Church as ultimate interpreter by handing that role over to the text itself. In the same spirit, Schleiermacher's undertaking to formulate a universal theory of understanding also originates from a paradigmatically modernizing moment in which nothing in the world any longer appeared self-understandable. And so the point is not to follow an authority that gives you interpretive cues to follow. You always have to look at the text. The text will give you the information, and you just have to be as knowledgeable as possible in order to make sense of it. The diversification and complexity of the modern life world provoked him to dare the remarkable move to find a common ground on and through which understanding could be generated. The spheres of historical, scientific, and philological knowledge exploded, and while numerous endeavors were underway to categorize, quantify, and institutionalize that knowledge, and of course, if we turn to Foucault, we learn a lot about these communicative and knowledge orders. Hermeneutics tried to find ways to make that knowledge palpable, to expose the necessity for such knowledge to be properly understood. At this point, allow me to explain one of the more provocative and yet deliberately provocative lines in my abstract that you find on the poster. The alleged rejection of knowledge for the sake of understanding. The assumed juxtaposition of knowledge as theoretical, quantifiable, and scientific, and understanding as an inherently and emphatically open sphere of experience. A juxtaposition which, of course, mimics the infamous, but in many circles still upheld distinction between the natural sciences and the humanities, the distinction between explaining in one realm and understanding in the other. As I have certainly invited such an arguably short-sighted and somewhat outdated line of argumentation myself, let me rephrase my basic assumption. I argue that there is a productive tension between understanding and knowledge. Furthermore, I want to discuss in how far understanding may only come about on the basis of a relentless confrontation with knowledge and ignorance, and within the playful to and fro movement of former and future experiences. And that knowledge in this regard must be understood as a storehouse of those experiences. Allow me to try and clarify what I mean by this by way of moving away from Schleiermacher to exemplarily discussing other central figures in the field of hermeneutics, continuing with one of the paradigmatic thinkers in my current research project on creativity and the creative self in US antebellum literature and culture, the philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, who, for that matter, had not only been a great admirer of Herder and Goethe, but of Schleiermacher as well. In his 1875 book, Society and Solitude, Emerson writes, "Knowledge is the antidote to fear. Knowledge, use, and reason with its higher aids. The child is as much in danger from a staircase or the fire grate or a bathtub or a cat as the soldier from a cannon or an ambush. Each surmounts the fear," Emerson continues, "as far as he precisely understands the peril and learns the means of resistance. Each is liable to panic, which is exactly the terror of ignorance surrendered to the imagination. Knowledge is the encourager, knowledge that takes fear out of the heart, knowledge and use, which is knowledge in practice." Knowledge in practice, an essential trope not only in Emerson's short chapter on courage, but in all of his writings. What appears as a rather self-evident post-enlightened idea, the image of knowledge trumping fear, is part of a greater investigation of what knowledge is and means to human beings. Emerson is revolving around the questions of what to know, how to acquire that knowledge, and what to do with it. What is more, Emerson seems to have a clear vision of what sort of knowledge is beneficent and which one is not, meaning that there seems to be lingering a distinction between different forms, spheres, and functions of knowledge. And it is that distinction that will not only lead us through the rest of this lecture, but that characterizes much of the history of literary scholarship. Knowledge is the antidote to fear. Knowledge is the encourager. Knowledge and use, knowledge in practice. With the performative rigor of the philosophical teacher, Emerson lets his readers know that knowledge is that which surpasses obstacles. Knowledge is a driving force. Knowledge is tied to action. Knowledge is essential to the everyday. It is essential to what it means to be a human being. Each and every one of us is only then liable to panic when we do not know. We are endangered by the moment when the terror of ignorance is surrendered to the imagination. Not knowing lets the imagination run harmfully wild, but it can only be harmful when it is not controlled. And this is the point I argue when literature can be brought into the mix. For is not the pleasure of reading literature based on the very potential to let the imagination run wild? Doesn't the act of reading, of opening and closing a book, of immersing oneself into a narrative, create a safe space and a circumscribed playing field for the imagination, so that the reader is not in danger to completely lose touch with herself, but is rather enabled to let her interpretations run wild nonetheless? And isn't this what the productive tension between text and reader is all about? Let me rephrase this. Understanding is dialogical. It is a communicative formation to produce meaning. And meaning in the act of reading is produced between the text and the reader. To understand means to acquire insight into something you had hitherto no understanding of. Only then something appears that had until then remained in the dark. Hermeneutics describes a movement to and fro between what is known and unknown, between the overcoming and the celebration of ignorance. In the words of Emerson, such to and fro movement of understanding is the drawing of circles. In his 1841 essay with the same title, Emerson uses the image of the circle to ground his quasi-theological philosophy of nature as a philosophy of understanding. Much in accordance with the famous image of the hermeneutic circle as the evocation of ever new horizons in the process of understanding the yet unknown, Emerson's circles envisions an inherently open self, that is, a self that does not bind itself to the established norms and knowledge formations of tradition. In Circles, Emerson describes himself as an experimenter, a self-description which leads me to one of the most striking features of hermeneutics' romance with the unknown, the romance with creativity. Emerson appeals to a creative energy, implicating that, as Richard Poirier argues, any idea of the self on which one relies becomes constrictive, a provocation to escape as from a prison. The quest for understanding demands from the self to take a significant amount of risks, to not rely on that which is safeguarded, but that which requires a leap, the drawing of a new circle. The self has to engage itself in a back and forth movement, a movement that makes self and experience equiprimordial. In his famous proto-pragmatist fashion, Emerson is basing understanding in the experience of the world, and thereby in the opening of the self unto the exciting space of the unknown as a horde of ever-new experiences. Emerson exchanges the primacy of cognitive knowledge, or in fact, in many ways also of some sort of metaphysical truth, for the understanding of the self as the emphatically indistinguishable concurrence of inner and outer world. Every experience is the anticipation of the never-occurring organic wholeness of all experiences. And even though there is some sort of knowledge about this never-occurring of an organic whole of experience, nonetheless, as human beings, we're some sort of, destined to still strive for it, to still try to understand. It's like, the gaining of some sort of truth, of some higher law of understanding, grasping some higher law, is this moment of kind of immersing oneself in the wholeness of one's experiences. Drawing circles marks the movement in and through which prior knowledge is exposed not to the destructive force of deliberate ignorance, but to its horizon of the yet unknown. The recurring acts of interpreting one's experiences by audaciously acting in the world sketches a hermeneutic practice much akin to the act of reading literature, thereby anticipating various pragmatist theories in 20th century philosophy and literary studies. The self, as the interpretation of its own experiences, constantly embarks in decidedly playful modes of hermeneutic self and world interrogation, meaning that interpretation uses the infinite space of the unknown as a play space for creative self-empowerment. A more extensive lecture, or preferably, as Peter Sondy has shown in the late 1960s, an entire lecture series on hermeneutics, would certainly be more systematic than this singular short lecture, and it would probably not allow for a leap from Emerson to Gadamer without the inclusion at least of Nietzsche and Heidegger, if not also that of John Dewey, William James, Charles Peirce, and others. And yet, by turning my argument onto the phenomenon of play, the transition from Emerson to Gadamer is as radical as it is plausible. For both Emerson's and Gadamer's hermeneutic philosophies concur that it is in and through play that human being can abstain from itself. In German we would say im Spiel von sich absehen können oder spielerisch von sich absehen können. For Gadamer, to briefly summarize one of his essential insights, play is the essence of the work of art and thereby of any literary text. And it is not the reader who is playing, rather she is immersed in an in-between space of hermeneutic self-experience. The play itself is playing her, thereby catering to a moment of utter self-representation and self-affirmation. To remain in the sphere of literature, in the act of reading, the reader encounters the text as what could be labeled the performative appearance of her own aforementioned movement back and forth. She's immersed in her open-ended play, in and from which, we might add, she receives aesthetic pleasure. The text affords its reader with the concentrated experience of knowing herself outside the representation, while all along deeming her to be the representation's very vanishing point. In an essay entitled Representation, literary scholar Wolfgang Iser therefore follows Gadamer's lead and claims that knowledge of what man is can only come about in the form of play. Meaning that it is in and through play, and one may argue that the act of reading provides the individual with an extraordinary play space, where the reader can abstain from herself. In Iser's anthropologically attuned reception aesthetics, reading is a performance that allows us to be both ourselves and someone else at the same time. We can refrain from ourselves, but do not lose ourselves. Right? We can sail on the Pequod, we can be, with Ahab and all the other crew members, and yet at the same time we know we are not there, right? This is the moment where we are both ourselves and someone else, where reading becomes a performance in and through which we kind of can be able to look at ourselves in the moment of being in it. But at this point, and I know I had to rush through these essential phases of literary hermeneutics, it is necessary and in fact crucial to understand that we can only embark on the experience of launching ourselves into the unknown on the very basis of knowing that we're provided for with a safe space for such experimentation. Held and carried by that knowledge, the reader is afforded the freedom to comport herself to herself in an ever-repeating play of self-creation and self-affirmation. This is, as hermeneutics have taught us, and I think Iser makes this all too clear, where meaning is most intensely produced. The desire to understand, Verstehen, is marked by the dynamics of understanding, Verständigung, and the tension of a force field of the new. Again, the quest for meaning and the processual nature of all sense-making activities are inherently creative, and it is so simply due to its essential dedication to the new. Any given text can offer a vast number of interpretations, turning the text into a storehouse of possible readings. And of course, as the saying goes, you will never read the same text twice, right? You always base your new reading on your former experiences, thereby making new experiences, thereby engaging in this drawing of circles, of ever newly creating also yourself as some sort of performative sphere actor within the logic of your hermeneutic encounters and engagements. At which point I would once more return to Emerson, who basically anticipates Iser's insights when he claims that there is then creative reading as well as creative writing. When the mind is braced by labor and invention, the page of whatever book we read becomes luminous with manifold illusion. Creative reading draws on the moment of self-experience as self-conception. In the act of reading, the reader becomes emphatically and productively unknown to herself, subjected to the responsibility of not only being, but also trying to have herself. And when Emerson's most cherished poet and philosophical comrade Whitman writes that what is known I strip away, he figuratively celebrates the very moment in which reading becomes a testing ground for the possibilities and the impossibilities, the potential of and the resistance against self-knowledge and creative self-affirmation. And this is, as a side note, exactly what my current research topic is interested in with regards to the antebellum culture of letters. Namely, the discursive dynamic of creative self-understanding and self-formation and the greater cultural impact such hermeneutics of the self desired. I argue that one of the driving forces of the culture of the young US American Republic was its celebration of the unknown as liberator and manifestation of the new. Innovation and experimentation, trial and error were of the essence. I'm interested in the narrative, hermeneutic, and aesthetic strategies deployed to constitute such a culture of creative self-interpretation. But to conclude, interpretation understood as one's launching into the unknown constitutes a dynamic act of sense-making and reality construction. The act of reading is both the liberation and the taming of creativity, for it very well accounts for excessive possibilities of individual self-extension, while it is, at the same time, bound to the parameters of a particular text. The tension between knowledge, understanding, and the unknown is thereby not only tied to language and discourse, but to the greater arsenal of experience and action, of refraining from oneself in order to emerge in experiential otherness. Right? And again, this is the safe space. We can try ourselves out, right? We can take the position of a murderer or whatever we want, right? Literature, fiction gives us a safe realm to try out new versions of ourselves. In this regard, it is not so much about introspection or self-reflection. Rather, hermeneutics, as I understand it, turns interpretation into both a process and a practice of pragmatic, that is, hands-on self-relation through narrative self-constitution and creative self-scrutiny. Knowledge of oneself is thereby not a limitation, but an ever-evolving opening of one's experience as a testing ground for possible identity formations. If everything is open for interpretation, and if knowledge can only come about in a reasonable assessment of interpretations, the intimate moment of reading a piece of literature affords the reader with the privilege to articulate something that had until then been utterly unknown, maybe even culturally taboo. And yet, in the spirit of the FRIAS and its lunch lecture series, let me include my discussion into the realm of interdisciplinary dialogue. For all that you have just heard is not to say that the interpretation of a literary text ought to serve as a prime model for all hermeneutic endeavors. Quite to the contrary, even though the literary text provides an extraordinary playing field for hermeneutic engagements, we must always already assume the existence of a hermeneutic plurality, in and through which all symbolic media need to find proper recognition. Hermeneutics, in its developments from Schleiermacher and Emerson through Gadamer to Isa and beyond, has proven to be an extraordinary framework for the analysis and understanding of interactional contexts, in which that which is known and that which had hitherto been unknown reciprocally evolve. And yet, the question of what exactly happens in the act of reading and the ways to adequately talk about it remain to be two of the greater unknowns in our field. But as we are certainly not ignorant of them, the furthering of hermeneutics and the interdisciplinary dialogue with, say, the cognitive sciences, anthropology, or philosophy can help us draw ever new circles around these questions. That being said, I hope that I could be able to shed some light on a particular phenomenon in literary studies, in and through which the interdependency of knowledge and understanding emerges as a most pleasurable romance with ignorance as the counter-knowledge to what it means to endure the unknown. Thank you.